Welcome to the Winged Wheel Podcast. Here to talk all things hockey are your hosts, Brad Crisco, Ryan Hanna, and Evan Lobsinger.
This was supposed to be a mock draft. The four of us are here, and we were supposed to be mock drafting. We're not making a single pick tonight, but I'm glad at least that the timing of this came so that myself, Brad, Max, and Prashanth could all be here to talk about the two trades that the Red Wings made today. The first of which was a surprise and I think a pleasant one. And the second of which was a surprise. And I think a lot of people had the same three-letter reaction. But yeah, at least we're all here to talk about it. Folks, welcome to an emergency episode of the Winged Wheel Podcast. Myself, Brad Crisco, and I'm joined here by Max Bultman of The Athletic Detroit and Prashanth Iyer of Expected by Whom. Max, Prashanth, how are you guys doing?
It's been a day.
You cranked out an article.
Yep.
Yes-ish, yeah.
What a day it is. What a day.
All right, let's just jump right into it. We're going to start with the Walman trade. We'll do the whole timeline after in a full explanation, but initial reaction to Jake Walman and a second-round pick attached to the trade by the Red Wings. They acquired that pick just earlier to the San Jose Sharks for the proverbial future considerations. What were your thoughts?
Well, not shocked that they traded Walman. I think when you go back to Steve Yzerman's press conference on Friday, he definitely was hinting that they would want to move something around on the blue line. You can go back and I asked him about Justin Hall, actually, and he talked about, having to make room for Edvinsson and Johansson. He talked about, we'll see what the blue line looks like going forward. And it sounded like he was setting that up to do something on the blue line. And well, my first guess would not have been Walman. He made another comment later in that press conference when he was asked about Walman, where he said, next year he thinks Walman will be, competing for ice time like everybody else. That raises some, alarms because this was a guy who played on the top pair for long stretches of the past two seasons. If you're in that spot, I have to imagine you're considering, at least thinking about moving a guy. What I would not have ever seen coming was having to attach a second round pick to do that, because this is a player who I think, frankly, was on pretty much exactly the right contract. $3 to $3.5 million. His cap hit was $3.4 million for a guy who's played right about 20 minutes a night, scored 12 goals this year, is a great skater and has shown to be able to defend transition quite well, even though his defensive numbers last year were really rocky in some of the toughest minutes in the league. It just wouldn't have struck me as you need to attach a sweetener to this guy's situation. But that is what this looks like as of now. We don't know if other dominoes are coming. I think we should put that out there that, if you're clearing cap space, which is the only motivation that we can see behind this right now, that's for something. So I guess there's still a little bit of an incomplete out there as to what that becomes. But I still think, no matter what that is, it's a little hard to understand why you had to attach to move Jake Walman. And that's kind of my reaction to having sat on this for a few hours now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the same boat. I think where I'm at is exactly where Max is at. I think it was clear when you looked at the roster that there were gonna need to be guys moving out. With Albert Johansson no longer being exempt from waivers, you obviously have to get Simon Edvinsson some playing time. They're both on the left side. There was going to be a need to get those guys into the lineup, or at least, get them some minutes. So you had a feeling that some of the guys were going to be moving out. I don't think Jake Walman was at the top of my list as a guy that I would have anticipated moving out. And then adding to that, almost doing it in a straight cap dump fashion, just attaching a pick for future considerations, which I know everybody's very excited about. Future considerations. Future considerations has not played a hockey game and will not play a hockey game. And more often than not is typically used to make AHL to NHL player swaps. So this will be very interesting to see what ultimately amounts from this. But to sum up where I'm at is, no matter what comes after this, spending a mid-second round pick to shed $3.4 million for a league average player who's 28 years old does not make sense in any realm to me. You could tell me that the Wings are trying to free up cap space to go sign Jake Guentzel. You could tell me that, tomorrow they're going to trade for UC Saros. that's great. You've added a player that makes the team better, but the way you created that cap space doesn't make sense to me. Detroit's not in a position where they can spend seconds. And yes, they went out and got an additional second to be able to do this, but it's just the math doesn't add up. And for me, it's sort of a critique I've had of Yzerman's moves over the course of his tenure is I don't think the cap dollar to draft pick ratio is right with a lot of his transactions. And this one in particular, I think is quite off.
Yeah, without getting repetitive, I echo everything Prashanth and Max said. It's sure someone had to go. If I understand other guys would be tougher to move and they'd be at a higher cost, but Walman's a decent player on a fair contract. We talked about it at length before we start recording, but waivers. If he goes on waivers and someone claims him, problem solved. Which even then, the fan base and us will probably sit here questioning it, going, why are you getting rid of Jake Walman for free? Because we all think at worst you could get a mid-round pick for him. Again, he's spent a lot of time on the top pairing playing tough minutes. That's valuable around the NHL. And even from a PR standpoint, if he goes on waivers and doesn't get claimed and then you attach a sweetener to it, everybody understands what's going on. We overvalue Jake Walman and the rest of the league views him this way. But now we can't know that because that was never an option. And again, I'm glad Prashanth brought it up because I feel the same way. They could go trade for Mitch Marner tonight. It doesn't matter. You did not need to attach that second round pick. That's just poor asset management. The optimistic view is I don't think Andrew Gibson was ever going to be an NHLer. And we talked about that on the podcast and people rip me for being too low on him. But you got rid of a guy who isn't going to be an NHLer for another prospect who might be an NHLer, but also probably won't. And then you got a second round pick on top of that. So sure, it's a free second round pick. You did a prospect swap and you got a pick and you unloaded it for this guy. Sure. But you had this second round pick that is asset, that's positive value for you that you could have used for whatever you wanted. You could have used that to get rid of Hull, or you could have used that as a trade up in the draft to go get a Berkeley Catton if he falls or something like that. There's so many things you can do with a second round pick. And I can't wrap my head around it. And again, as I mentioned, if you needed the cap space quickly, okay, by whatever time tomorrow when waivers would have been up, but we're sitting here at 10:30 at night and nothing's happened yet. So I don't know. I'm very puzzled by this move. And with this amount of cap space here, and nobody's going to be surprised here. I'm always the most pessimistic of the group, but Yzerman's checkered free agent history, I'm even more concerned.
I think one thing we are going to have to reckon with is that I think we are all generally believers in Jake Walman, the player. I think, having watched him for 2 years, I think we really like this player. Clearly, we got to reckon with the fact that Detroit didn't feel quite that same way. And I can pull up the advanced numbers here really quick and look at a couple things that jump out, right? Year one, which is when he earned this extension from the Red Wings, his numbers are really, really strong, right? It's a 52% expected goal share, really good defensive number to that in terms of the expected goals against per 60, really good goals against per 60. You look at last year and it drops down to 41% expected goal share. The goals against per 60 goes up by a full goal per 60 minutes. The expected goals against per 60 goes up by nearly a full goal. Like there was downward trend last year. But I think when we watched it, we said, yeah, well, we watched the guy the year before. This is injury. This is playing the toughest minutes in the NHL next to Moritz Seider. That's what this is. And, whatever. Slotting will figure this out. Health will figure this out. Clearly, the Red Wings had a different read on it. And that's something that sometimes happens, right? Like, it will not be the first time. But that's the thing I'm trying to square the most right now is even with those drops, I thought this is a guy you redeploy, you try him on the third pair, you give him sheltered minutes and he cooks. And there are a lot of guys like that it's like in the third pair minutes they can cook and you ask too much of him and it falls off a little bit. I thought worst case scenario, this is a guy making $3.4 million. That's not a problem contract on a third pair. Just redeploy it there and see how it goes. I know that it was a crowded blue line for sure. And I can understand why they might prefer keeping Olli Maatta, who has, 1 year left on that deal and is really steady, just kind of perfect for the third pair role. I'm just surprised to see, to be the fourth person, I guess, to say that the second time I've said it, that it required an asset attached to do it, because it's just not the view I have of this player.
Yeah, I mean, you look at just some of the prices paid. Now, granted, the key to Walman is he has 2 years at $3.4 million, but I mean, Buffalo got a 4th round pick for Eric Johnson. I mean, it's like you look at some of these deals that were made at the deadline, and yes, they were shorter term deals. They weren't guys that were having as much money that you have to commit to. But with the cap going up significantly, I can't reconcile that. I mean, you've had teams spending for Joel Edmondson. Like, you had teams spending for Colin Miller. There were not picks attached to those guys to be able to move them. And it's very surprising to see that in this situation. I can't wrap my head around it, regardless of what comes after this move.
So to rewind to earlier in the day and give the full overview of what happened, as was alluded to, the Red Wings traded Andrew Gibson, who was a 2nd-round pick from last season, 2023, to the Nashville Predators in exchange for a 2024 2nd-round pick originally belonging to Tampa Bay, 53rd overall, and prospect Jesse Kiskinen plays in Liga in Finland, right shot winger over there. So, Brad, I know you said you don't think Gibson was an NHLer. I actually think he had a good season with the Sioux in the OHL, and I think he did enough based on his final season in the OHL to say he is a plus prospect, or at least on track. Was he worthy of a 2nd-round pick at the time? There's differing opinions. I think he could have played, but regardless, these aren't earth-shattering prospects being moved back and forth, and that's the ultimate point that's being made here.
I mean, they signed the guy. They signed the guy less than 2 months ago to an ELC. They clearly thought something of him.
Yeah, and I think he can play, but that's moot point, because that 2nd-round pick that came back, I thought that's more than worthwhile. Like, you got a prospect back, whether Kiskinen ends up being a player or not, you got a prospect back. You added a 2nd-round pick. You have now, I've been beating the drum for a long time on this podcast to say you have a wealth of defensive prospects and prospects in general, not on the right side necessarily like Gibson, but start to leverage them, leverage the potential into more different assets. That second could have been a cap dump, not the way I thought it was going to happen. It could be, like Brad said, to move up. It could be for a trade, whatever. That was the trade that I think most people were pleased with. Then that same 2nd-round pick and Walman was moved to San Jose. The surprise here, as we've stated a bunch of times now, is that the 2nd-round pick was attached. I don't think there's any way to kind of get around the surprise with that until we see what happens next. Whether or not that retroactively makes things make sense remains to be seen. The big qualifier on all this is, it's 10:30 on Tuesday night. We'll see how this goes. Beyond that, what potential moves can you see coming next? Because the urgency, the cap space being cleared, and the premium being paid to do it kind of all points to something happening soon. Because otherwise, it really doesn't make sense for it to happen on the timeline that it did.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think one of my first thoughts was, okay, well, they really want to re-sign Shane Gostisbehere if they're doing this, right? They clearly, Gostisbehere has the power play element. He was, I think, 12th among NHL defensemen in scoring last season. He was a player that frankly looked like they might be crowded out if they couldn't move at least one, if not two bodies. And my first thought was, okay, is this clearing up space to sign Gostisbehere? But I think you make a good point, Ryan, that like there's a time element to that doesn't line up with this one, right? Like you had another, and I guess they could come out with a Gostisbehere deal tomorrow and maybe that makes sense, but you had some time before other teams could start talking to Shane Gostisbehere and work that out. It didn't feel like something that would have to be, and the Red Wings may not feel like this was rushed, frankly. The Red Wings may have put more into this than, obviously more than we would see. What's funny is, I don't know, this might sound crazy. I think I'd rather have Jake Walman than Gostisbehere at the number, right? Jake Walman at $3.4 million, great skater, big shot. No, he's not going to run your first power play, but I think Mo Seider can run your power play. Granted, not as well as Shane Gostisbehere, but not that big of a downgrade that I would feel the need to go give like a $5+ million deal to have Gostisbehere do that when I, frankly, over what I've seen in 2 years, the better part of 2 years, especially when healthy, I prefer Jake Walman at even strength. And I really like that player, the assets that he has, the skating, the shot. Am I crazy for saying I'd rather have Walman at 3.4 than extend Gostisbehere?
I'm with you. 3.4 for Jake Walman for 2 more years. I mean, Gostisbehere, you're looking at it, you're probably going to have to give him, at least 4 years some amount of term. I mean, you're talking about an AAV of probably around $6 million or in that ballpark. Yeah, I mean, for the numbers, I'm certainly going to lean towards to Walman. And we have to also remember, Gostisbehere was a guy that got scratched during the season too. It's not like he was the coaching favorite throughout the entire season. I mean, he was a guy that also took his turn sitting on the bench and watching from the press box. So, to then turn around and say you're going to give this guy, like, this is the guy that you want to commit the money to, it seems a little weird to me. Going back to your original question though, Ryan, I think additional moves that if you're wondering about this from a timing standpoint, I mean, it is June 25th. The biggest thing that comes to mind for me is you want a period of exclusivity to negotiate with somebody. Whether that's internally, like Max said, with Shane Gostisbehere before they hit the market, or Patrick Kane before they hit the market officially on July 1st, or is it you're going to trade for somebody's rights? So Carolina's been very public that they would trade Jake Guentzel's rights if, they didn't feel they were going to come to a deal and they couldn't make something work. Is that something that you're considering? The other one is Steven Stamkos, although that's a no move clause. And again, I'm not sure about that. And then Sam Reinhart's another one that those are really the only three where it would make any realm of sense to say, okay, yeah, I need to trade for their rights of exclusivity because you're confident you're going to get a deal done with them, before July 1st. But even then, if that's the move that makes, I still don't know that way of freeing up the $3.4 million makes you substantially better the very next day.
Yeah, and to branch off that point, if the Red Wings are out there about to give Sam Reinhart or Jake Guentzel or Elias Lindholm 8 years, that in and of itself is a mistake. All great players, don't get me wrong. I don't want someone to sit here and say those guys are terrible. But by the time the Red Wings are good, they're going to be well into their 30s, making $8, $9, $10 million. And you lose all the flexibility you had when Jake Walman's cap would have just come off the books in 2 years. And I don't necessarily think that's the most likely scenario, because we've seen the reports that the Red Wings are still negotiating with Gostisbehere and they're still negotiating with Kane, and the Raymond Insider contracts are out there. The Red Wings have about $32 million in space. If they bring those four back, that's about $32 million. So you moved Walman to run it back to 9th place like you did last year? That also doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So there are scenarios out there where this makes sense, but those two would concern me greatly. Like if they're freeing the space to go for a 25-year-old Nate Chess or a legitimate superstar like Mitch Marner, okay, I understand the logic here. Or even, I think we were talking about earlier today, Jacob Trouba retained or something like that, because then you're getting a right-handed defenseman, whatever, make of Trouba what you want. I understand those moves, but I don't think that's the way it's going.
Here's the most generous interpretation of it. Like, I think this is a little bit of a devil's advocate situation. First off, Yzerman and the organization, even though they talk about wanting to be perennial contenders and being willing to make moves that hurt in the short term to make the long term better, which aligns with the thinking that Brad just put forward, have also shown that they are very keen on making more acute short term moves to improve the team. They sniff the playoffs and they want to add to get them to the playoffs. I don't necessarily disagree with the thinking overall. Like, removing ourselves from this situation, we've seen that be successful to a degree, and I think there's more kind of leeway to work in that space than what we or the fan base would have thought of before. And I think this past season is a good indication of that and how it can be successful. Another aspect to this is, whether you believe it or not, I'm sure there is some semblance of the administration that thinks, yeah, that second round pick was Andrew Gibson like a couple hours ago. And so it's really not that big of a deal. And Jake Walman is, he's a good player, but by the end of the season, he was scratched and he was never the same after his injury, and whatever else might have happened behind the scenes, whatever, all that compounds. Like, there's not one big, easy black and white answer, but all those things combined makes it so, yep, it's not really that big of a deal. And essentially we just moved a prospect and got rid of cap space, which is a much bigger plus. And yes, the fan base is a big fan of the guy, but his stock has fallen off more than they appreciate. Like, it's not a sexy answer, but is that the most kind of reasonable one?
Yes, and that's what I meant. Like, we kind of have to square that just we're four guys that believe in Jake Walman and believe in his game. And clearly there's a different opinion on the front office that's trading him, right? And I do agree with you. I think the most palatable way to look at it is you traded one of your many defense prospects to free up $3.4 million cap space. I think though you have to kind of let that one go real quick before your brain hooks on it and goes, wait a minute, but there was more to that, right? Like when they got the second rounder in Kiiskinen, who was a guy that I liked in his draft year, like as like a potential second rounder maybe. So when they got him and the pick, I was like, oh, great. So they move a D for a forward prospect, probably fairly similar probabilities of working out for the two of those guys. And now they can use this pick to move up in the draft or, put it toward a trade for a player or whatever. Yeah. But then you attach it to unload a guy who, even if you didn't feel about him the way that I think we did, about his game, I still think it just surprises me. It just surprises me. I mean, but that's what I mean. We got to get over the fact that clearly the front office's opinion of the guy was not our opinion of the guy.
Yeah. And I agree with that point where I think we can all agree you're almost certainly right on that. But it still is I'm going to call it poor asset management and lack of due diligence. Like it all felt rushed. And the one thing I can't get out of my head is the waivers. Like you got to try. Even if you called every GM in the league and said, Walman's on the block, what are you offering? And everybody said no. You still try. You never know. Free agency negotiations aren't going the way in Vancouver for Tyler Myers like they thought they need a replacement. I don't know, something along those lines, but it just feels rushed, if that makes any sense. I don't know. Every move Steve Yzerman has made over the years, even the ones I have passionately disagreed with, I understood what he was doing and where he was coming from. I hated the Andrew Kopp contract the day it was signed. But I got it. They needed a center. He likes his 200-foot players. I understood where he was coming from. Same with Ben Sherratt, and you can go down the list. This one, I don't see where the logic came in at any point. Yes, you're right. They didn't like the player, but
at one point they did. They extended him, but
yeah.
Something in their opinion of him has to have, like, it's just the only explanation. Something has to have changed in it over the last year.
Yeah, and again, you're almost certainly right, but throw him on waivers and just try.
I have to imagine they did, like, the shopping around did happen. You mentioned this as we were chatting pre-recording, Max. Like, Steve Yzerman doesn't leave meat on the bones in trades, and I think that was a good way to put it. But the waivers is the part where I'm like, the only way the waivers doesn't make sense is if you knew for a fact that he wouldn't be claimed or there was an urgency to it, as we've said before.
And that's where we're still waiting, right? Like if another shoe on this drops, it's only 10:30 p.m. as we record this. So we still got 3 hours tonight before I'm going to feel comfortable going to sleep. But yeah, like it is a surprise. And the waiver thing, I think makes sense to me. Like it's something that, did New York know that Barclay Goodrow was getting claimed when they put him on waivers? We will never know. But they put him there. And they gave the opportunity for someone to solve that for them for free. And when we talk about, I should clarify, when we talk about the Red Wings front office and their opinions on Walman, it is in the context of the cap hit, right? They do need cap space. It does not necessarily mean that they don't like the player. They just may not any longer feel he's going to play a role that is a $3.4 million a year role, right? Like that's how we talk about Justin Hall. Clearly they like Justin Hall enough to go sign him last summer. He didn't play a role, and now we anticipate or we have anticipated, we'll see if this changes that it would mean they had to move on. Yzerman traded for Klim Kostin, and then a few months later had to trade him away because he wasn't playing, and you can't scratch a $2 million forward every night, right? So everything's in the context of the cap hit here. And maybe it was just that, with the way that this season went, with all the injuries, with the dip in the numbers, that they just felt 3.4 wasn't tenable for them anymore. I guess.
Okay, we are going to take a quick break to let you know that this episode of the Winged Wheel podcast is proudly brought to you by Labatt Blue Light. Created in 1983, this premium light Canadian Pilsner is a delicately balanced beer brewed with Cascade hops and a blend of malt. It's fresh, crisp, and brewed to the highest quality standards. There's a little bit of Canadian kindness in every sip of Labatt Blue Light. How did it get in there? They're Canadian. That's how. You can spread the love yourself by sharing a Labatt. And when you do share a Labatt, you're not just sharing a beer. You're sharing an experience that'll pair with anything from hockey to a hoedown. So next time you're watching a hockey with your buds, be sure to share a Labatt, because while you might not all root for the same team, although we on this podcast do hope you're rooting for the Red Wings, you can all enjoy a Labatt Blue Light. We honestly love going to games in Detroit and seeing Labatt being the beer that fans clamor for all over the arena. It's a reliable beer and great to have in your hand when celebrating a goal. So head to the link in the description of this episode or the one you see on your screen to find Labatt in stores near you today. You must be 21 or older, and as always, enjoy responsibly.
You know, where I'd come back to on all of this, and I'm going to try and say it as eloquently as possible because it's going to almost certainly get misconstrued by somebody as bashing Steve Yzerman, but really what it comes down to is in the context of a hard salary cap, every dollar matters. And probably my number one gripe across his portfolio of moves is, you know, it was sort of okay to spend a little bit more here. It was okay not to get the efficient value here, or it was okay to make the Kyler Yamamoto deal, get him, buy him out, and then go, you know, negotiate with Kostin only to flip him immediately. And then you end up, it's fine because none of those were affecting a team that was quote unquote immediately in contention. But it's the sum of all of those little inefficiencies that has now led you to a scenario where you are attaching a second round pick to move Jake Walman. And it's because you need that $3.4 million. And that's really where I come back full circle to, is in a hard cap environment, every dollar matters, every draft pick matters, and it is imperative that you extract max value from that every single time you make a transaction. And I just don't think that's been consistent. You know, to Brad's point earlier, you could stomach a lot of the deals made because you understood it was a little more than maybe that needed to be paid, or it was a little more that needed to be given up, or you would have liked to have gotten more. But obviously we're not in the room making those deals, calling those GMs, and understanding what the market looks like. But what we're at now is we're at a scenario where you are now having to basically use all of those things you've stockpiled to sort of tread water. And that's a scary proposition right now, because if you look at where the Wings are with the $32 million that they've now got in cap space after moving Walman, what can they realistically do that improves this team to comfortably be a playoff team? If Mo Seider and Lucas Raymond are going to eat at a minimum $14 million, maybe up to $18 million, in that space, what can you realistically do with $14 million remaining, and how much more are you going to have to sell off to try and turn this ship around? And that's where I think the Wings have gotten themselves into a bit of a pickle, to just kind of put it bluntly. Should they be trying to spend that $32 million all this summer? That is my question.
It's not a strong free agent group. That's why I said earlier, I'm nervous about what they could do with all that cap space, because I don't love a lot of what's out there. I think the best options to improve the team aren't in free agency this year. They're in trades, which, again, that second round pick could have been useful coming in, because, you know, you get numbers in your head, and I start throwing around. If Patrick Kane costs $7 million and Shane Gostisbehere costs $6 million, okay, well, if you're willing to throw a bunch of trade assets at one of these guys, Mitch Marner costs $11 million, Jake Walman costs $3 million and change. Which of those pairs would you rather have? It's just, again, to Prashanth's point about inefficiencies, yes, I can see a world where Gostisbehere is a better player than Walman, full stop. I don't think it's that big of a difference, but I can see the argument. But that $3 million matters, because that could be another player, or that could be the difference between you getting Mitch Marner versus Patrick Kane.
Here's maybe something that's another devil's advocate line of thinking. Jake Walman on the left side had his issues down the line last season. You have Edvinsson, who's not in the Wings. He's ready, and my prediction is he ends up on the top pair by the end of the season. You have Albert Johansson. If he does well, you want to make space for him as a second pair lefty or a third pair lefty. Shane Gostisbehere represents nearly 60 points on the right side, and we've talked a lot. The Red Wings scored really well last season, and it was quite surprising. But you don't want to lose that because you're scared of that shooting percentage and the regression that may come. So keeping Shane Gostisbehere will go a long way, especially if you're afraid of Patrick Kane walking, right? Because they're still at an impasse, and Patrick Kane is probably going to go to market to see if he can get the 3 years that he wants. So, all this just boils down to the same point, the devil's advocate line of thinking I put forward earlier, which is that, yeah, it sucks because Walman was a fan favorite, but in terms of all the evils that you had to do to clear this cap space, Jake Walman's not necessarily the worst case scenario, even though he was so well liked. Second round pick notwithstanding that you had to attach to it. I don't know. And also like I agree that the death by 1,000 cuts has been a big problem with Yzerman's cap structure, to the degree where now you're wondering even about how Seider and Raymond's deals would fit in before this cap space clearing. Isn't moving Jake Walman to try to alleviate that maybe a step to kind of clearing all that out? It's uncomfortable, but it's not necessarily moving backwards.
Depends what they do with it. Going back to Brad's point, right? Like if you're trying to clear $3.4 million of cap space on June 25th, that tells me you intend to use all your cap space, right? Like you're not trading this guy to clear up cap space if you don't intend to use that space. And to Brad's point, like are you going to sign Marchessault and somebody else? And you know what I mean? Like how much are you going to do? How many multi-year contracts are you going to give out in free agency, and what is that going to position you for going forward here? Because I'll tell you, we don't know how many of the guys in next year's class are going to get to free agency. I sure like it a lot more than this year's, looking at it, a year out today. And that's probably the case in most years, because then the best guys re-sign with their current teams anyway, and it thins out or whatever. But I don't know. To me, there is a little bit of like, especially after the way some of these contracts have gone the last 2 years, you have to be a little hesitant with like, how are they going to use this money, and is it going to be efficiently spread around?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it, right? Is now that you've cleared up another 3.4 million, we just said that there's sort of been those death by 1,000 cuts where it's been these slight overpays. And so are you even going to have an efficient use? And ultimately, all of this is going to come down to, what Raymond and Seider signed for, which we could litigate that entirely and recognize that these two were eligible for contract extensions July 1st, 2023. And we're sitting here now and running it down to the wire after kind of Lucas Raymond had a monstrous year. So all in all, I think it's just been that death by 1,000 cuts. And I'm not comfortable saying that the 32 million or whatever else ends up getting cleared out gets spent in a way that makes his team meaningfully better, not just next year, but for years to come, as Yzerman wants.
Qualifying this with the fact that this is an extremely noisy part of the season, and this season especially because the Stanley Cup Finals ended 30 seconds ago, and the draft is 30 seconds from now. But in terms of, hearing things, quote unquote, I have heard everything from Guentzel, as we mentioned, to Gibson quite heavily, to Saros, and before he was moved, Ullmark, to, so many other big name players, Nachas, that the Red Wings are in or around on. And are they all true? No. Anyone who kind of receives tips and sources around this time of year knows that a lot of it is just obscurity and smoke and mirrors. But the general theme is Detroit is around on a lot of big things. So I don't disagree when you guys say, like, yeah, a lot of it could be spent this year. It could be boring answers like Seider and Raymond. You want to free up more money to be able to sign them for longer and keep Gostisbehere and keep Kane, and there you go. But I get the sense that the Steve Yzerman is potentially looking for this team to look a lot different in a couple weeks.
I mean, that kind of, I think that's when we talk about not knowing exactly how this deal is going to look until we see the end of, free agency, basically. That's kind of what it comes down to, right? Like, I don't think with all the lefties that they're coming into this situation with, that it's unreasonable at all to move Jake Walman. Again, it comes back to the cost, but if you prefer Olli Maatta as your third pair guy, yeah, like Ben Sherratt's in that top four. Simon Edvinsson, I think, is probably in that top four. Something's got to give there. But it comes down to, okay, you made the decision that you wanted this cap space so bad that you were willing to attach a second round pick to clear up $3.4 million. What are you going to do with it? And if what you do with it is really sparkling, then I think all of us will be willing to say, okay, well, they made the team X amount better, and that was probably worth Andrew Gibson or a second or however you want to phrase it. But if they come back, to Brad's point, if they come back and they did this just to look pretty much like the 23-24 Detroit Red Wings, you got to ask why.
I think that's a good spot to leave it, because predicting the future with Steve Yzerman is a fool's errand, as today has been evidence of. We did want to get kind of an emergency reaction out to you folks. I know a lot of people were wondering what to make of this. And I think, Max, you just summarized it very, very succinctly. So with that, I'm going to leave you with two pieces of content for you folks to look at. First, Max Bultman of the Athletic Detroit. His words are gold. Go to his Twitter account at @M_Bultman. Click the links on any of the articles that he posts right from there. Subscribe to the Athletic Detroit and you will be better for it. Also, Prashanth Iyer alongside Sean Shapiro hosts Expected by Whom. All their episodes are fantastic, but just last month, I think it was, they interviewed Jake Walman, and that was a really, really great episode. Might be a little bit heartbreaking to hear now, but it's very, very worthwhile to get to know the person and the player. So I'll leave you with that. Max, Prashanth, thank you both so much for joining us.
Thanks for tuning in to the Winged Wheel Podcast. Be sure to check out wingedwheelpodcast.com, where you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll also find links to other ways to support the show, such as Patreon, official podcast apparel, and more. And don't forget to follow the show on Twitter at Winged Wheel Pod. And of course, the hosts at Brad Crisco, at Ryan Hanna WWP, and at Hockeytown Evan.